Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. Time for another episode of our mini series Let's Talk About with me, Andrew Musgrove, and John Gibson. Last week's episode was all about the future of Kieran Trippier, and this week's episode is all about the future of Nick Pope, and in particular, the number 1 jersey at Newcastle United. The Magpies have been linked to several shot stoppers already this summer, some that will cost a pretty penny, and it leads to the question of the future of Nick Pope. We're just going to flag that we are recording this around about a week before it actually goes out because John is going on a well-deserved break. So he wanted to get it in the bag before he heads off on his jolly. So obviously, in that time, things could have progressed. Other links could have come out. Nick Pope could have come out and said, I'm going. He's not going to do that, but he could do. So I'm just letting you guys know not to write in and shout at us if some things don't add up. But of course, if anything dramatic happens, the episode probably won't go out anyway, but I don't think something is going to happen because it's particularly early in the window. Right, John, let's get into it because, as I've said there, it's very early on in the summer and already Newcastle have been linked to several goalkeepers. My first question to you, John, is do Newcastle United need a new number 1?
They need a new goalkeeper of authority because we're in a goalkeeping revolution at Newcastle right now. We've got Nick Pope, yes, but Martin Dubravka, who's been a very loyal and consistent performer over years for Newcastle United, is not quite up to what we need for the modern Newcastle United that's trying to break into the top 4 and trying to win some silverware. He's not good enough to be the regular goalkeeper, which he had to be in the second half of the season. He's 35 years of age. He's got 1 year left on his contract. Now's the time to sell him, and you're not going to make a fortune, but now is the time to unload him. That being the case, Karius has already gone on a free transfer. We knew that was going to happen because of his personal life. Mark Gillespie signed an extra year on his contract, which might have surprised a few people, but essentially is the 4th choice goalkeeper, not the 1st choice goalkeeper. So unless Eddie knows something we don't particularly, which is he's got an absolutely outstanding academy keeper that can slot in as the 3rd keeper in the pecking order. We need 2 goalkeepers. We need a goalkeeper that challenges Pope, and then a 3rd choice goalkeeper with Gillespie the 4th choice. So unless there's a great kid that's going to get a kick up, we need 2 goalkeepers. But yes, in answer to your question, we need somebody that's not going to just sit behind Pope, but is going to say to Pope, I want your jersey, and you know what? I'm going to come and get it. And we've got to bear in mind this guy missed 23 league games this season because of his shoulder injury. Will it pop out again? Could it go at any time? Could he get an ordinary injury? We are very vulnerable. We are as vulnerable in the goalkeeping situation as we are vulnerable in the centre forward situation, in my opinion.
And it's a fine balance, isn't it? That question of do Newcastle United need a new number 1? Because for me, Nick Pope is still Newcastle United's number 1, regardless of what happens this summer. I can't see them going out and spending a ton of money because if they do, then that keeper that comes in will be the number 1. For me, I can't see Eddie Howe doing that to Nick Pope because I think there'll be a lot of hope that Nick Pope's injury, as you've mentioned there, the shoulder, which it seems like once you do it once, it's very vulnerable to going again. And as a goalkeeper, that's something you definitely don't want. You can kind of manage it as an outfield player, but not as a goalkeeper. But we have to keep our fingers crossed that it doesn't happen again and Nick Pope can get back to his best. I mean, we saw against Brentford, John, when he came in for the first time since that Man United game, when he picked up that injury, he was good. He made some crucial saves, and he's a step up from Martin Dubravka. And when I look at the links to new goalkeepers, I just sit there and think, are you really going to spend £30 million on the Valencia goalkeeper, £35 million on him, or 40 million on Aaron Ramsdale to have them sitting on the bench? I can't see it happening.
Well, I think Newcastle will try to be very clever in producing the second goalkeeper, and I'm for another senior goalkeeper, and that is, I mean, Pope's on the wrong side of 30, but that doesn't matter in a goalkeeper. It matters in an outfield player. It doesn't matter much in a goalkeeper because they go on so much longer. I think Newcastle will try to sign a young goalkeeper, but of genuine experience, who will push Pope and not just sit behind him and be grateful to sit behind him, in the way that Tino Livramento has pushed Kieran Trippier, which we talked about in the previous podcast. And you can do that. For example, you mentioned the guy that's at Valencia, the guy with the unpronounceable name, which you will now pronounce, and I will most certainly will not. But he is 6'5". He's only 23, and he had a terrific record last season of keeping goal. Now he fits the criteria. Forget the price. I mean, 30 million these days is not big dough. And if you want to live in the top four, brother, you pay 30 million for players, because you're not buying the best. You're buying the best at 100 million, which is what we have put on Bruno. So if you're not going to spend anything, you've got to get dead lucky. But this fella would push Pope now, this Valencia keeper, would push Pope now and would be the future Newcastle in the way that Livramento has pushed Trippier and is now ready for the first team. Because this guy is only 23. We've been linked with James Trafford, the Burnley keeper, who's only 21. Now, Ramsdale's a different kettle of fish. Ramsdale wouldn't come here unless he was guaranteed number one, because he's not going to sit as number two. He's already doing that at Arsenal, and it's cost him England, etc. So he's not going to do that. He's 26-year-old anyway, and I don't want to give them 30 million, 40 million, because I might just come back with that and a few more quid and say, we'll take Isaac. So thank you very much, mate. You can keep Ramsdale and stay down there out the way. I don't want their goalkeeper. But the Valencia goalkeeper ticks a lot of boxes to me. I'm not seeing him every week, so I'm not 100% certain, as anybody can be. He's got 16 caps for Georgia. He's got a good reputation. Trafford worries me a little bit. He's got a good background. He was at Man City. He's been brought up the right way. But a young keeper, 21, great in theory, went into the Burnley side, full of high hopes, plays it out from the back, lovely, starts making mistakes. Of course he does, he's only 21, and he went out the Burnley side. So Newcastle would know more about him than I do, in terms of he's got the background, but he's 21, he's young, his confidence was shattered last season. I'm not overly thrilled there, but I would take the big guy out of Valencia. And I think that's the type of signing Newcastle want. A 23-year-old with a lot of first-team experience, a current international, who is young enough to be the next one after Pope, but also will challenge Pope this season. Because, as I've said many times over the last couple of seasons, whoever you've got, unless it was Messi in his pomp, there's somebody better. There's somebody better than Nick Pope, who's terrific, and he is one of the reasons we only finished 7th last season, because we missed him so much. But there's better goalkeepers than Nick Pope. Dare I say it, there's better midfield players than Bruno, and there's better players up front. I'm very tempted to say, is there better than Isaac? Because I'm not certain, given age and given that there is. But in most cases, there are better players out there. And that is so here. And I think that somebody like the Valencia keeper would be clever, because he's into that age group, but he's significantly younger than Pope. It's not good buying a 28, 29-year-old goalkeeper to play behind a 31-year-old goalkeeper or whatever it is. But he's got to be able to push Pope now. And this guy will not sit there forever. Ramsdale will only come with an absolute stonewall guarantee he's number one. And I don't think that Eddie Howe would give him that guarantee.
Well, it's interesting. The chap from Valencia, I'm going to have a go at pronouncing his name, but listeners and viewers know I'm awful at pronunciations. But it's Giorgi Mamardashvili, I think is how you pronounce it. So there you go. But it's it's interesting because the guarantee of first team football, I think, is the most important point here, because he is a man who was wanted by Bayern Munich not so long ago. So he has big admirers. And if Newcastle United are leading the queue for him, I'm all for that, because he does look like a good quality goalkeeper. But I'd be intrigued to know what is offered if it gets to contract talks and it gets to, representation, because he's not going to leave Valencia to play second fiddle to Nick Pope. So the question is he offered a guarantee of first team football, or is he told to come in and say, well, we're there, you've got to earn that number one spot on the training pitch? Because, of course, in an ideal world, John, you want two top-class goalkeepers, because you want that across the entirety of the squad. You want two world-class players, top-class players in every position. But it doesn't work like that, because players want to play football. And at least outfield players, you can kind of build that up. You can kind of have a first right back. You mentioned, Tino Livramento, where they will get their opportunities because of substitutions or because they need a rest. But you don't tend to change your goalkeeper unless they've made a gaffe. So I really do struggle to see Ramsdale coming in, the Valencia keeper coming in, unless they've been offered some sort of guarantee, because there's a lot of money to spend for two top-class goalkeepers, either one who comes in. And if they haven't been guaranteed first-team football, I don't see why they sign.
Well, in that case, all we'll get is a 21-year-old somebody that's grateful.
But you see my point, because like Ramsdale's obviously not happy sitting on the bench. I mean, if he wants to come and sit on the bench, he'll just stay at Arsenal and collect his paycheck.
Oh, I mean, he's a bad example. The reason we won't have him is because he has got to be guaranteed. You don't know that other players, you can sell them the club, you can sell them the long-term situation, you can say that I've got an open mind on it, you will get opportunities to play in the first team. You can guarantee, if you want, that you'll be the first team keeper in the two domestic cups, in the way that Manchester City did with Ortega, playing who was said to be a world-class keeper behind another world-class keeper at Man City. But it depends how you sell it. I mean, but you spend money on players. I mean, look at the money we spent on Livramento and we spent on Hall. And they were both brought in initially a year ago as cover fullbacks. But we spent around the 30 million mark. I mean, there was a guarantee, 28 million for Hall, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to do that. They may be able to sell the overall picture of Newcastle United to this big guy. But you can. The ideal world is that you have two quality players for every position. That's what Manchester City have eventually got to. We are nowhere near that at the moment, but we'll eventually get there if we keep growing. And at the moment, we don't want, I would suggest, with utmost respect, we don't want Dubrovka sitting behind Pope with Carriers gone and only Gillespie in, perhaps an academy keeper, because we are in big stuck then, mine. And Nick Pope is in a comfort zone, which I would suggest doesn't do him much good, as well as not doing Newcastle much good.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you look at Nick Pope, as I say, at 32, with worries about the injury he's had. And then you look at the options. So you go, well, we buy Trafford, he's going to play backup. He's going to cost you, what, 15, 20 million pounds, and he's going to be second choice goalkeeper. But Nick Pope's longevity, what, at the top of the Premier League, what, 2 years? And at that point, we will then have to spend 30, 40, 50 million on a brand new goalkeeper, at which point the Valencia keeper has probably moved on to another team. If he hasn't, he's probably going to be having to cost Newcastle a lot more. It does seem a bit of a turning point, or a bit of a turning point when it comes to Newcastle's goalkeepers. In one way, John, did they maybe say to Nick Pope, right, we are going to go out and spend 35, 40 million on the chap from Valencia. He's going to come in. He's not been guaranteed first team football, but he's more than likely going to be the number one goalkeeper. Are you happy with that?
Well, that's up to him. I mean, he's happy or not. That's his problem. Newcastle sign who they want to sign, and in fairness to him, would take him in and say, look, exactly what you said. You're not guaranteed first team football, but neither is the other guy. It's up to you to prove that you're worth first team football. It's up to you to prove that your shoulder's going to be rock solid for a full season. And what is can you ever say anything? Newcastle United have got no guarantees that somebody won't put 100 million down for Bruno before June's out. You've got to live on shifting sands, and Pope has got to accept that. I mean, Pope was an England goalkeeper at one time, and certainly always in the squad. And before he got the injury, he was left out of the squad by Southgate and was no longer a regular England squad player. This sort of thing happens. In an ideal world, I would like to see someone like the big Valencia goalkeeper who's at the right age, the right build, coming in and really pushing Pope all the way. For me, if James Trafford comes in, he's 21. He was dropped by Burnley for the second half of the season. He is very much a number two keeper. And that's not going to do Nick Pope any favours, etc., etc. Or it's not going to do Newcastle any favours. The difficulty with the Valencia goalkeeper is he says that he wants his future settled before he plays in the Euros, which is June the 14th. I mean, whether he's signed or not, he wants to know with the club he's talked to, yes, you want us for definite, and I will definitely come. It's an ideal world. Football isn't an ideal world. He mightn't get what he wants, but that's what he would like to happen. And let's put it another way. Newcastle have been on his case for a while. On the case of Ramsdale and that as well, but Newcastle have been on the case of this big keeper for a while. Now, that means they'll have spoken regularly to his agents and the people that represent him. Now, if it was a matter of I'll only come to you if I'm nailed on, guaranteed, written in my contract, I'm number one, and Newcastle said I can't do that, he would have said, well, I'm not coming, and the interest would be dead. We've got to presume if the interest is not dead, there's something there's wiggle room, as I call it, for a deal to be struck if we decide that's the best option, and he decides it's his best option. But it's not been blown out the water.
It's certainly interesting because it is definitely two different extremes. One in Trafford, who is, like you say, a young goalkeeper who needs to develop and progress. You've got the Valencia keeper, who's only a few years older than Trafford, but is definitely towards the top of his game. And, he looks like an elite goalkeeper at such a young age. And it's going to be really interesting to see what they do because if they go after the Valencia keeper, he's got to be number one for me. If they go after Trafford, you're right. He becomes a little bit of element of competition because he's got so much to learn. He's not really going to be pushing Nick Pope. I think the other interesting thing is, John, Nick Pope for me is still a very, very good goalkeeper. If he's number one for Newcastle come the end of the transfer window, I've got no qualms about it, as long as the injury doesn't come back. If he's second choice, say the Valencia keeper does sign, and it comes apparent quite quickly that he's going to be first choice, Nick Pope's going to be playing second fiddle to him, I think teams would come in for Nick Pope. I can see him having plenty of suitors from the Premier League. And I'm talking, the teams just in and around Newcastle, not necessarily the top four, but, the likes of maybe West Ham coming in for him and offering him a first team football. He will have suitors if it becomes apparent that he's not first choice at Newcastle.
But if you want to be a top four club, which Newcastle want to be, you've got suitors all the time because you've got good players. You've got good players. And the first time a player doesn't look as if he's a regular in the first team, he's in the squad, people come sniffing. And a lot of clubs have a decent turnover of players. If you look at Liverpool and Man City, and you take them as great examples of the clubs we want to be, they've had a big turnover of players, It's never affected them. But, Mane and for money. They've had great turnovers. And you think of all the players, Morris and your Toure way back right away to the two Silvers, and they've had Aguero. They've had turnovers of players all the time. It happens. Now, Nick Pope, I think, yes, let me put my colours to the mast as well. I think he's absolutely terrific goalkeeper. I think he killed our season together with Joe Linton. They're the two players we missed the most. There's no question about that. And Nick Pope is terrific. And I'm not putting him down or suggesting we need an upgrade automatically on him, like I'm thinking we need an upgrade automatically on Dubrovka. I'm not doing that. If he's my regular goalkeeper next season, that's fine. But we are in a goalkeeper revolution right now, because beneath Hope, Dubrovka is not the answer. Karius is gone, and Gillespie is very much a fourth choice goalkeeper. So we are exposed at keeper level. We need a number 2 and a number 3 at keeper level. And we've got to get on with that. And I'm not certain that I want, that I go from Dubravka at 35, obviously a little bit past his sell-by date, to James Trafford at 21, dropped by Burnley as my number 2 goalkeeper. And it might well be that Trafford, who has a huge reputation, has played for England at all the age levels, etc., would turn out to be a fabulous signing. I'm just meaning my initial reaction to it. He might turn out to be terrific, and it might be the route Newcastle should go down. But right now, sitting here at this moment, I would like to go with Pope and the Valencia goalkeeper fighting out for number 1, and then we'll look at it, who should be 3 and who should be 4.
Yeah, well, it's certainly going to be an interesting one. And it probably comes back to one of the main criticisms by a few people of Eddie Howe, and I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but there are questions over his loyalty to players. There are questions over to whether he can be ruthless in the situation of cutting players free. I think he can. As I mentioned in last week's episode, he's done that with Dummett and Richie. And I think this is another one that will fall into the camp. We are getting to this stage of the project where tough decisions have to be made. And there'll come a time when they have to be made on Jacob Murphy and Dan Burn, very good players for Eddie Howe. But in terms of the development of Newcastle United into an elite club, them tough decisions are going to have to be made. And I think it is now probably the time to be made on Nick Pope. If it doesn't come this summer, John, it's going to come next summer. We're not talking about kicking the can down the road for too long. Has Eddie Howe got it in him to make these decisions? I think he does. Do you?
I think he probably does. He better have, by the way, because if he doesn't, then he's in trouble. And I think he has. There's a great difference between loyalty to players and while players are with Newcastle wanting the camaraderie, and he almost it's a very tricky thing to do, but he almost wants to be the manager and one of the boys at the same time, because that gets the best out of the players. He can be one of the boys in the dressing room, but then when it comes to putting his mask on and match day, I'm the gaffer, you're dropped, you're playing, etc. I think that he can do that. I think he's intelligent and he knows he has to do that to survive at this level. He's left his comfort zone, that was Bournemouth, and is now in the elite end of the game where it's dog eats dog. And, he's got to fight his corner in that situation. He can be loyal. That's not an awfully bad thing to have. But I mean, I must stress that, when we talked in the last episode about Kieran Trippier and me saying, well, this is perhaps the time that we say to Kieran, we love you to death, we'll always love you, but now's the time for a very emotional partner of the ways. I'm not suggesting that with Nick Pope for 1 minute. I think he's a quality good goalkeeper who can be my number 1, and this kid can come in from Valencia, because he is a kid at 23, and challenge him for the first team job, and Pope see him off and keep the first team job, and this fella keep pushing him and playing the 2 domestic cups, etc. Pope is not at the same stage as Trippier, not by any imagination whatsoever. But if you bring in a number 2 goalkeeper, forgetting the obsession with is he number one and number two. If you bring in a second goalkeeper to challenge Pope and he takes over in the first team, I'm dealing with theory here, and he is our first team regularly, and Pope doesn't like it, and I would thoroughly understand that. Then he can go in January as one of the people we've got to sacrifice for financial fair play, the senior players bit, while we get our finances topped up. And I would hate to see that happen. I want to see Nick around, and I want to see another quality goalkeeper around. Because I tell you what, when you go with one goalkeeper, as good as Nick is, when you suddenly haven't got him for a long space of time, like this season, by Jove, do you suffer? The reason we aren't in Europe is because of Nick Pope being injured. And the reason why we aren't actually perhaps even in the Champions League is because Nick Pope and Joe Linton were injured.
Yeah, and you say that, and that is the reason I just can't see Newcastle United signing an elite goalkeeper at the top of his game, which I do think the Valencia goalkeeper isn't far away from that bracket. We're sitting here and we're saying the reason Newcastle haven't qualified for Europe is because they missed Nick Pope, and I agree with you 100%. I also agree with you, John, that he's nowhere near the same scenario that Kieran Trippier finds himself in. But I just think all that considered, it makes it a really interesting summer when it comes to a goalkeeper, because you say there the Valencia chap might come in and it'll be all about competition, and listeners and viewers of the podcast know that's my favorite word. I'm a big fan of competition. We need competition because without competition, you can't improve. But I just can't see Newcastle splashing out that amount of money and that player being backup to Nick Pope as a goalkeeper. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But at the same time, I don't think Newcastle are going to be in a hurry to replace Nick Pope because he's still one of the best goalkeepers in the Premier League, one of the best goalkeepers we've seen for Newcastle United. You're talking about Shea Given is the best Premier League goalkeeper we've seen in black and white. Well, then it's Nick Pope afterwards. He's that good. And I think he's got a big part to play in Newcastle United. But it just makes this whole goalkeeper talk even more interesting and even more intriguing.
The funny thing is, Andrew, that if we went for that, taking your theory that you wouldn't see Newcastle going in for a second elite goalkeeper because Nick Pope's Nick Pope and because it would cost money, etc., etc. James Trafford, who's only 21, let's use him as an example, and it could be none of these people. We could get another goalkeeper plucked from left centre and he becomes the Newcastle player. But if it was somebody like James Trafford, where we're going down, who would accept being a number two goalkeeper, you would presume, because he's only 21 and his future's ahead of him, you're still talking about, they're saying, around the 20 million mark. You might be able to do it in stages, 10 down, 15 at that stage. But you're talking 20 million when for 10 million, somebody like the Valencia keeper might be that much more experienced, etc., etc., etc. But you would, even if you buy a 21-year-old goalkeeper who's been dropped by Vincent Kompany for the last 4 months or whatever, it's going to cost you the thick end of 20 million to do that.
It is, and that's what makes the decision even more interesting. As I mentioned earlier, it is a kind of a turning point, a tipping point. It's a big moment because you are right. Do you spend 20 million on a player who's got loads of potential and I think will be a good goalkeeper in the years to come, but who comes in accepting that he's not guaranteed first team football, but who will push for Nick Pope as Nick Pope's spot? Or do you go and spend an extra 10, 15 million on the chap from Valencia who will come with an expectation of first team football and wanting it now? He was wanted by Bayern Munich. He's a very talented player. And that's what makes it all the more interesting. It really is. And I think if you buy Trafford, he becomes backup and you look at him becoming number one, maybe in 3 or 4 years' time, plenty to learn from Nick Pope. You buy the keeper from Valencia, he's number one. And for me, I can't see him coming unless he's number one. I wouldn't want Aaron Ramsdale. Don't think he's an upgrade on Nick Pope. I think the Valencia goalkeeper would be, but then I do think that probably puts Nick Pope's time at Newcastle at an end. And like I say, all these elements just make it all the more interesting. But I do think bringing James Trafford in, John, it's not like you're bringing someone in just to be number two. I think you're bringing in someone with massive potential. It's not like you're bringing Karius in, who we knew was going to play backup to backup to backup. It's not like you're signing Mark Gillespie, who knows he's going to be very fortunate to get any out in next season. You're bringing in a goalkeeper who's played Premier League football last season, didn't go to plan, but can push. And in a couple of years' time, we'll have expectations. So many elements flowing into this conversation. I want to know what you guys are thinking in the comments. Let me know. Do you want a new goalkeeper? Doesn't your choice for your goalkeeper come in and instantly replace Nick Pope? Or are you looking at a younger goalkeeper who can learn from him, still push him, and in time replace him? Really intrigued to get your comments. This has been Let's Talk About Newcastle United's goalkeeping situation. Not the sexiest of titles, but I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation, actually. And I'm not really any further forward on what's going to happen, but it's one to keep an eye on, and we will bring you all the latest transfer news on chroniclelive.co.uk. Hit subscribe, hit follow, leave us a rating and review. And for myself and John, we'll see you guys next week.